So, having established these fairly simple requirements, I'm going to turn to creating an entity relationship diagram. It's basically going to be a pictorial model of the data I want to capture, the things I want to describe, how I'm going to describe them in my database, and the connections or relationships between them. It follows a standard notation that its chief value, I guess, is a communication tool. Another person conversant with the ER modeling notation is going to be able to look at it and very rapidly understand what sort of data I want to model, roughly how it's laid out, and they could get a picture right away of what the resulting database would look like. I'm going to do this model in PowerPoint. It's not a particularly good drawing tool, but it's good enough for most of the things we'd want to do in this course. And the notation we're using in INFO605 is typically called Chen Notation. It's not terribly well supported by most modeling tools like Visio and such. So I'm going to do our very little simple model here with friends and books and borrowing. I'm going to go ahead and do that in PowerPoint. We'll see how that works out. I fire up PowerPoint here, and what you can see I've done is I've put a few shapes out here to kind of help me get started. We will certainly cover the modeling notation used in this course in more detail when we get to the appropriate weeks, but for this high-level overview, we can just blow through a few things fairly quickly. The rectangle here represents an entity, something I want to describe. I put the name of the thing I want to describe in the middle. So, first thing I had was book. I know I had another thing I wanted to describe, which was friend. The oval up here represents an attribute, a way of describing one of these entities. So characteristics of the entity that are going to represent the actual data I record in my database. What do we say a book had? Well, for one thing, we know that it had a so-called ISBN number. Add that in there. This guy a little bit larger. The book also had, just making some copies of it, I believe a title, and whether or not it was hardcover or softcover. We'll say, give it a title and a cover type. I'll just call it cover for now. Got room for this guy here. Okay, so I have my attributes modeled. These are associated with the book. Part of the notation I use says that when an attribute is a so-called identifying attribute, when I'm going to use it to point to one specific book I want to track, then I make sure that guy is underlined. So I'm putting an underline in there to indicate that ISBN is the way I'm going to identify these things. Now I need to connect them. Draw little lines that are going to bring these guys together. And so I know now that, sorry, I need to get these guys back. Title is connected to book, as is ISBN. We're going to do the same thing with cover here. Okay. Putting those all together, I have modeled a book. I have shown how we're going to uniquely identify one, and some attributes to describe it, title, and what sort of cover it has. Over here I'm going to do something very similar with friend. I'll just borrow this guy, make a few copies of him to use for friends. I said for friends that I was going to create an identifier that I'll call friend ID. Let's put that in here. Make this a little bit larger. This is going to be my unique identifier. So I'm going to make sure that it is underlined, as we did in the other case. Other things for friend. So we had a first name, a last name, and we also said we'd have an email address so that we can get in touch with our friend. So I'm going to put that in here. I'll abbreviate this as F name here, just to use a little less real estate. L name, we'll go with a similar convention for the last name. Make a little more room. And we're going to go with email. Once again, I need a mechanism for connecting these up to the entity with which they're associated. It's a shame I keep losing the where I'd like to be in terms of the toolbars. So as I mentioned, PowerPoint is not necessarily the ideal tool for this sort of thing, but it's passable enough that we should be able to make it work for a lot of things we'll do. And actually, you may notice that a lot of these slides that I've put together for the course are the models are done with PowerPoint. You'll be able to see sort of very similar shapes outlined there. Okay, so I have you can see red squiggles here for spelling errors, and PowerPoint's not liking the way friend ID is spelled, for example, but you can ignore those. So I have modeled book and friend, two things I want to keep track of. But something's missing. I need to say something about the connection between book and friend. And what was that going to be? It was this concept of borrowing. A friend can borrow many books. When you're doing an entity relationship diagram, a very rough rule of thumb is if you see a noun, something like book, that you then go and describe with title, etc., things that are obviously describing the book, book becomes a so-called entity, and things like title, whether or not it's hardcore and softcover, that are describing that book become attributes of book. ISBN would be in the same category as well. So nouns, roughly speaking, are good candidates to be entities, things to be described. When you see a verb like borrow, especially if it's between two entities, we'll turn that into a relationship. That's the R and ERD between the entities. So the way I model a relationship in the Chen notation is to use a diamond. Let's find one of my shapes somewhere. There we go. There's a diamond. Now draw a diamond between these guys. I'm going to give it a name. Borrows. Get a little larger. Come on. The painful part of working with PowerPoint. I'll put this guy in the middle. Now there's notation that I won't entirely explain about the lines you draw around relationships, but suffice it to say, by connecting this as I am, I'm indicating that borrows is a relationship between book and friend. Okay, so here I have the representation of that connection. There are a couple more things I might want to say. I want to do something called cardinality, which tells me how many books I can have per friend and how many friends I can have per books. So I know that a friend can borrow many books. For any given friend, there are many books potentially at least. And since I want to record the history of borrowing, it might be the case that for any given book, there are multiple friends. Any given book could be, over the course of time, borrowed by multiple friends. So this is a so-called many-to-many relationship. The way I reflect this on my entity relationship diagram, I'm going to put an M on one side, and I could put, by convention, an N on the other side if you were to use an M. Not a big deal. This basically reflects how many friends, there can be many friends per book, and there can be many books per friend. In some cases, not all relationships are going to be many-to-many. Some will be one-to-many, occasionally one-to-one, etc. But for this particular relationship, there can be many on each side for any one instance on the other side, and I record that on my entity relationship diagram. So it looks like I've got most everything, except I am missing the start and end date of the borrowing, the date borrowed and the date returned. I'm going to throw those guys in there as well. And in fact, you can have attributes on a relationship. Boom. Steal 2 copies of this guy. This guy name. So I'll have 2 attributes. I'm going to call it start date abbreviated, end date of borrowing. And I'm going to show that these are, in fact, connected to the borrows relationship. Start date and end date effectively are describing not friend or book, but the conjunction between those two, the borrows relationship. Okay, I'll get rid of this guy. And there you have it. A fairly simple problem. We have this simple narrative textual statement that is more or less in plain English. And I have captured all of the salient points in here, all the rules in which I'm interested in, what I'm going to describe, how I'm going to describe it, how I'm going to uniquely identify each entity, as in the case of ISBN and friend ID, and then I'm going to show this connection or business rule, one might say, between the two things, that I can have many of one side for each of the entity on the other, each instance of the entity on the other side, and I've also got things that describe the relationship proper as opposed to the things that are being related to one another. Of course, we'll go into entity relationship diagrams in more detail in the appropriate week of the course, but here's a simple example of moving from a narrative problem statement, such as I showed you in the Word document, and putting together an entity relationship diagram that models it. Another designer could look at this at a glance and really get a quick picture and a very accurate picture of all the database relevant considerations in modeling this particular problem space.